Gary Sheffield is one of the greatest hitters in Major League Baseball history, a name tied to power, precision, and rare durability throughout more than 2 decades at the highest level. He finished his career with 509 home runs, placing himself in the very small group of players who surpassed the prestigious 500 mark, while also owning more than 2,600 hits and more than 1,600 RBIs, numbers sufficient to define a great career. Sheffield was selected to 9 All-Star games, affirming his consistency and class across different eras of the league. In 1997, he played a key role in helping the Florida Marlins win the World Series championship, marking the collective peak in his illustrious individual career. With a batting average of .292, he was not only a power hitter, but also one of the most complete hitters, combining power and technique. Sheffield was also one of the very few players in MLB history to achieve all 3 major milestones: 500 home runs, 2,500 hits, and a batting average near .300. His distinctive swing style, quick, powerful, and almost unpredictable, made him a nightmare for pitchers for many years. In every team he played for, from the Milwaukee Brewers, San Diego Padres, Florida Marlins, to the New York Yankees, he always left his mark as one of the most dangerous hitters on the field. But behind those seemingly indisputable numbers was another story, a story about prolonged pain and a will that was never allowed to rest. Gary Sheffield was never given recognition commensurate with what he had done, and that became a lingering cut throughout his career. He grew up in an environment that forced him to be strong from a very early age, where weakness was not accepted, and he entered MLB with the same mindset, always having to prove himself, always having to fight. Even when reaching the peak, he was still placed under doubt, still looked at with wary eyes, especially during the period when baseball was covered in controversies. The achievements that should have brought honor instead became subjects of debate, making him carry the feeling that he was never good enough. But it was precisely in that unfairness that Sheffield's will became clearer than ever. He did not stop, did not withdraw, did not accept being forgotten. He continued to compete, continued to stand firm, continued to fight not only to defeat opponents, but to affirm his own value in a world he had never fully belonged to. Before continuing into the story behind those great numbers, please hit like and subscribe to the channel, as a way to acknowledge a man who fought his entire life to be recognized. And if you once believed that talent is always rewarded fairly, we have seen a Gary Sheffield standing amid great numbers but not fully embraced by recognition. Then to understand why that happened, we need to go back to where it all began, a childhood with no room for safety. Tampa, Florida in the years he grew up was not a picture of the American dream, but a space where violence, poverty, and instability seeped into every corner of life. The streets he walked through were not always welcoming. The sounds ringing out at night were not always laughter, and each passing day was not a journey of discovery, but a challenge to survive. There, a child was not allowed to be innocent for too long. Innocence was not something protected, but something easily lost, and for Gary Sheffield, that happened much earlier than what a child should have to experience. Family was supposed to be the place that brought a feeling of stability, but in his world, stability was rare. There was no solid foundation to lean on, no moments long enough to feel protected, and no clear protection from what was happening outside. Everything could always change, and that very change made a child learn to be vigilant about everything. While other children were still learning to trust, he had to learn to observe, learn to read situations, learn to know when to stay silent and when to protect himself. No one taught him those things in a gentle way. Life taught him through unavoidable collisions, and each collision left a mark, not on the body, but in the way he viewed the world. The feeling of having to take care of himself too early made everything heavier than a child could bear. There was no space to make mistakes innocently, because mistakes could bring real consequences. There was no time to be weak, because weakness could be exploited. There was no place to hide, because everything was right there, in front of him, clear and impossible to ignore. And it was in that environment that Gary Sheffield learned to exist without relying on anyone. He learned to keep distance, learned not to reveal too much, learned to build a shell hard enough not to be hurt anymore. But that shell was not strength in the usual sense. It was a survival mechanism, a natural response of a child who had no other choice. Those experiences did not create a gentle or approachable person. They created a person always in a state of readiness, always feeling the need to prove himself, always reacting quickly to any sign of doubt or disrespect. When he stepped into the baseball world, those things did not disappear. They followed him, becoming part of the way he played, the way he communicated, the way he faced pressure. People could see a strong, confident Gary Sheffield, even hard to approach. But few saw the origin of all that. Few realized that behind every strong reaction was a past that had taught him if he did not protect himself, no one would do it for him. The most heartbreaking thing was not that he had to grow up in such an environment, but that he had to accept it as normal. There was no clear moment to mark that childhood had been taken away, because it had never truly existed in a complete way. Everything happened quietly, little by little, until that child was no longer a child. And when he stood on the baseball field many years later, when tens of thousands of people followed every swing of his bat, very few knew that behind that precision, behind that strength, were memories of a place where nothing was truly safe. Perhaps that was exactly why Gary Sheffield never played like someone who had enough. He played like someone still trying to escape, like someone still carrying the feeling that everything could be taken away at any moment. Each hit was not only an effort to score, but also a way to affirm his existence in a world he had never fully trusted. And when looking back, perhaps what makes this story heavy is not what he achieved later, but what he had to endure from a very early age to be able to stand there. Because before Gary Sheffield became one of the most feared hitters in history, he was a child learning to survive in a world that was not gentle at all. And when a child grows up in a world with no guarantee that tomorrow will be better than today, any escape that appears becomes precious to the point of being almost absolute. For Gary Sheffield, that escape did not come from school, did not come from any protective system, but came from one person, Dwight Gooden, who was not only his uncle, but also the first door that opened a different path. Gooden entered Sheffield's life not as a perfect role model, but as living proof that there could be a different world outside the streets where he grew up. While others saw a boy who had to take care of himself too early, Gooden saw potential, a rare focus, a way of holding the bat and observing the game unlike children his age. He did not only teach Sheffield how to play baseball, but taught how to exist in a system where only the strong could survive. The first practice sessions were not gentle moments. They carried discipline, repetition, and strictness. Gooden did not allow mistakes to be repeated, did not allow carelessness to exist. Because he understood clearly the world Sheffield was about to step into had no room for half-hearted preparation. Talent could open the door, but only discipline could keep it open. Sheffield learned to stand correctly, swing correctly, read situations correctly, and most importantly, learned to keep his mind from wavering when everything around was unstable. Those lessons did not only apply on the baseball field, but also became the way he faced life. In each hit there was precision, forged through thousands of repetitions. In each movement there was the vigilance of a person accustomed to having to protect himself. But what made this relationship complex was not what Gooden taught, but what Sheffield witnessed. Because Gooden was not only a guide, he was also a story unfolding, a story in which talent and fame were not enough to protect a person from mistakes and unseen pressures. Sheffield saw Gooden rise, become one of the most outstanding pitchers, praised, expected, placed in a position millions dreamed of. But he also saw cracks beginning to appear, signs of losing control, wrong decisions that no one could fix for him, For a boy, that was not only the story of a relative but a clear warning. Success is not the end point, and sometimes it is only the beginning of another battle. That truth came too early, but precisely because of that, it sank deeper. Sheffield no longer saw baseball only as a game. He saw it as the only chance to step out of where he had grown up, but at the same time as a risky path where every wrong step could bring big consequences. There was no innocence in the way he approached this opportunity. There was no feeling that everything would naturally turn out fine. Instead, there was an almost absolute focus, a determination that did not allow himself to slip because he had seen what could happen if control was lost. What Gooden went through did not make Sheffield turn his back on the dream, but made him cling tighter to it, but with a different awareness. If he was not disciplined enough, not alert enough, not strong enough, this path could lead to places he did not want to go, and from then on, baseball was no longer one choice among many. It became the only choice, not because he had no ability to do anything else, but because everything else was not enough to take him out of the old environment. Each practice, each game, each time standing in the batter's box carried a much greater meaning than the score. It was a step farther from the past, a way to build a different future, even if its shape was not yet clear, but at least not like what he had known. Sheffield did not have the privilege to try and fail many times. He did not have a buffer to fail and start over. That made every effort heavier, but also sharper. In those years, as his skills gradually perfected and opportunities began to appear more clearly, Sheffield did not only bring his talent. He brought memories of where he came from, brought the image of Gooden at both extremes, the peak and the abyss, and brought a fear not easy to name, the fear that if he was not strong enough, he could lose everything before he could hold on to anything. That very fear kept him at the practice field longer, made him repeat movements until there were no mistakes, made him not allow himself to be satisfied too early. And when the real opportunity came, when the door to the professional baseball world began to open, Gary Sheffield stepped through it, not like a person pursuing a dream, but like a person who had no other choice but to succeed. And when the door to Major League Baseball finally opened, it did not welcome Gary Sheffield with patience or compassion. It did not ask where he had come from, did not care what he had to overcome, and certainly did not give him any time to adapt. Because at that level, everything happened immediately. You either proved your worth or you were replaced. There was no middle ground, no guaranteed second chance. And for a person carrying a past like Sheffield, that was not only professional pressure but a repetition of a rule he had known from very early. If you were not good enough, you would disappear. The first days in a professional uniform were not like the dream many imagined. There was no prolonged glamour, no protection from the system, but only evaluating eyes, dry numbers, and cold decisions. Sheffield was not seen as a story that needed nurturing, but as a product that had to prove its value immediately. Each time on the field was a test, each missed hit was a minus, and each small mistake could become a reason for people to doubt him. No one said it directly, but it was present in the way he was treated, in the way opportunities came and went, in the way people were ready to move on to another name if he did not deliver fast enough. For many young players, MLB was where they gradually matured. For Sheffield, it was where he was forced to perfect himself from the beginning. There was no space to learn in peace, no time to get used to the speed of the game. Pitchers did not slow down because he was young. Spectators were not patient because he was just starting. And the team did not wait because they always had other options. That turned every game into a real battle, where he was not only facing opponents, but also facing his own fear that one day the opportunity would disappear before he could grasp it. The initial mistakes, even small ones, did not pass lightly. They were remembered, repeated, and gradually formed an image he did not want. An unstable player, someone not ready, an unpolished talent, and, in a system with little patience, labels like that could stick for a long time. Sheffield not only had to fix mistakes on the field, but also had to fight the way others perceived him. That made every step forward harder. Every small success had to be bigger than usual to erase the doubts that had existed before. The feeling of being tested never stopped, even when he began to play better, when hits became more accurate, when his name began to appear more on the stats. The doubt still did not completely disappear. It only changed form. From doubting ability, people shifted to doubting consistency. From questioning skill, they shifted to questioning personality. And Sheffield, who had grown up in a world where everything could be taken away at any moment, could not help but react. He did not stay silent before doubt. He did not accept being defined by incomplete evaluations. But those very reactions made him even more seen as someone hard to approach, someone not easy to fit in. In such a system, existing was not only a matter of talent, it was a psychological matter, the ability to endure, how long you could stand firm before getting tired. Sheffield had no choice to withdraw. He had no safe path to return to. Everything he had gone through before led to this moment, and giving up was not a realistic possibility. That forced him to learn to adapt in a different way. Not by being softer, but by being tougher. Not by waiting for recognition, but by continuing to move forward regardless of whether anyone recognized it or not. Time passed, and with it Sheffield gradually understood more about the system he was in. This was not a place for absolute fairness. This was a place where results were measured by numbers, but the story behind the numbers was not always listened to. He learned to focus on what he could control, on the swing, on preparation, on every moment on the field. But even when he did those things well, the feeling that he always had to prove more than others still did not disappear. And perhaps what made this period heavy was not the clear failures, but the accumulation of non-stop challenges. There was no single moment when everything collapsed, but there was also no moment when he could truly relax. Everything was always tense, always demanding more, always setting a new standard. And in all of that, Gary Sheffield continued to move forward, not because the path became easier, but because he had become accustomed to having to walk even when there was no guarantee that ahead would be brighter. And then, over time, what Gary Sheffield brought to the field could no longer be easily overlooked. His swings began to create a different sound, sharper, more decisive, as if each contact with the ball carried an affirmation that no words could replace. He not only kept up with the pace of Major League Baseball, but gradually surpassed it, becoming one of the hitters that pitchers had to calculate carefully before facing. The numbers began to change clearly. High batting average seasons, stable home run counts, hits in the most difficult situations. Sheffield did not just appear, he dominated the game. He did not need too many words to affirm his position, because every time he stepped onto the field, he did it himself. And precisely because of that, the professional respect for him was almost absolute. Teammates knew he could make a difference. Opponents knew he could break any plan. And those who truly understood baseball knew they were witnessing one of the greatest hitters of his generation. But the strange thing was that along with that respect, there still existed a distance that was not easy to erase. Sheffield was not someone everyone could easily approach. He did not try to please everyone, did not try to adjust himself to fit common expectations. He kept his own way of seeing things, his way of reacting, his way of protecting himself that he had built from a very early age. And in an environment where fitting in was sometimes valued equally with talent, that made him different. Not in a way that was praised, but in a way that made people keep their distance. His public image gradually took shape through moments when he reacted strongly, through times when he did not hide his emotions, through the way he directly faced what he considered unfair. For many people, that was a sign of an uncontrollable personality. For Sheffield, it was simply the way he existed. But when those two ways of seeing did not meet, the distance began to widen. People saw a version of him that was easier to understand, easier to label, and that version did not always reflect the real person. Meanwhile, The real Gary Sheffield was much more complex. He was not a one-dimensional character. He carried discipline, focus, and also wounds that not everyone saw. But those things were not always expressed outwardly in an easily acceptable way. Instead, they were hidden behind straightforwardness, behind quick reactions, behind a shell he had become accustomed to carrying since he was very young. And when others only saw that shell, they did not have enough information to understand the rest. The gap between public image and the real person became clearer as his career continued to develop. On the field, he was one of the best. Off the field, he was not always perceived in the same way. Stories about him did not only revolve around achievements, but also around the way he behaved, the way he reacted, the way he was different. And in an environment where stories could shape perception as strongly as numbers, that difference became very important. The isolation did not come immediately. It formed gradually, over time, through small interactions, through unexplained misunderstandings, through moments when he felt he did not fully belong where he stood. Sheffield was still part of the team, still contributed, still played at the highest level. But the feeling of connection, the feeling of truly fitting in, was not always present. And when a person had become accustomed to having to take care of himself, the lack of that connection did not make him stop, but it made the journey lonelier. What is worth noting is that isolation did not reduce the quality of his play. If anything, it even made him focus more on what he could control. Sheffield could not change the way others saw him overnight, but he could control the way he stepped onto the field, the way he prepared, the way he prayed, and he chose to focus on that. But even when he did his part well, the distance still existed, like something that could not be completely erased. In an ideal world, superior talent would come with full acceptance, but in the reality Gary Sheffield was living in, those two things did not always go together. He was respected for what he did on the field, but not always understood for the person he was off the field. And when those two things separated, a void appeared, the void between being recognized and being understood. Gary Sheffield continued to compete, continued to create moments that made people mention him, continued to prove that he belonged in the group of the best. But behind all of that, there was a reality that did not change. He was walking a path that not everyone walked with him, a journey where excellence was not enough to erase the distance, and where one swing of the bat could make the entire stadium fall silent, but could not make the world come closer. And when the gap between talent and understanding grew larger, the collisions in Gary Sheffield's career also gradually became clearer. He did not go through his peak years in ease or favor, but in a series of prolonged disagreements with coaches, with management, and sometimes with the very environment he was contributing to. Tactical decisions, the way he was used on the field, or simply the way he was perceived in the team, all could become sources of tension, not because he sought conflict, but because he did not accept what he considered unfair. And for a person who had grown up in circumstances that forced him to protect himself, staying silent before injustice had never been an option. Those disagreements did not always explode in the big events, but they existed like an undercurrent, continuous and hard to control. A comment from a coach, a substitution decision, a way of handling a situation he did not agree with, all could make him react. And when that reaction happened, it was not gentle. It was direct, clear, and sometimes made others feel uncomfortable. But for Sheffield, that was not opposition, but the only way he knew to protect his value. He did not learn to stay silent to keep harmony. He learned to speak up so as not to be overshadowed. Those very reactions gradually shaped his image in the eyes of the public and the media. Gary Sheffield was no longer mentioned only as an outstanding hitter, but also as a difficult-to-control personality, someone quick to anger, someone not easy to cooperate with. Those labels, once they appeared, were very hard to remove, And when they were repeated enough times, they began to become the default way people saw him. Not everyone cared about the reasons behind his reactions. Not everyone asked what had made him that way. They only saw the result, and from there drew conclusions. That created a hard-to-escape loop. The more he was seen as someone hard to control, the more Sheffield had to face wariness. And when he sensed that wariness, his natural reaction was to keep distance or react more strongly, not because he wanted to create more conflict, but because he did not feel he was in an environment that truly trusted him. And when trust did not exist, every interaction became heavier, every word could be misunderstood, and every action could be interpreted negatively. In the clubhouse, this made building lasting relationships harder. Sheffield was not someone who did not want to connect, but the way he connected was different from many others. He did not open up easily, did not share easily, and did not easily overlook things he felt were wrong. That made some teammates keep their distance, not because they did not respect him, but because they did not know how to approach him. And when that distance existed, it not only affected personal feelings, but also affected the way he experienced the very environment he was working in. The tension came not only from relationships, but from the continuous pressure to maintain performance while facing unfavorable evaluations. Sheffield was not only competing to win, but also to fight against an image that had been attached to him. Each time on the field, he was not only facing the pitcher, but also expectations, doubts, and prejudices that had existed before. That made every game heavier, every mistake bigger, and every success needing more effort to be recognized. What is worth saying is that all of this did not happen in a short period. It stretched over many years, over many teams, over different stages of his career. Each time he changed teams, there might be a new opportunity, a new environment. But what he carried did not disappear. The previous experiences, the ways of seeing that had formed, all went with him. And therefore, even if the context changed, the basic feeling remained unchanged. He still had to prove, still had to protect, still had to stand firm in a system that was never completely comfortable with who he was. Perhaps to outsiders, those conflicts were signs of an unstable career. But when looking deeper, they reflected something else. A man who did not accept being defined by what others imposed. Gary Sheffield did not choose the easier path. He did not adjust himself to fit every expectation. He kept his own way of seeing, his way of reacting, and his way of protecting himself, even when that made the journey harder. And that very choice made his career never truly smooth. But in all the tension, in all the collisions, one thing did not change. He still competed, still contributed, still maintained a high standard that not everyone could keep in similar circumstances. That did not diminish the difficulties he faced, but it showed a consistency that was not always easy to recognize, because when a person had to face pressure on the field while also handling tensions off the field and still kept his performance, that was not only talent, that was a different kind of strength, a kind of endurance not easy to name. Gary Sheffield continued to move forward in his career, not in comfort, but in prolonged tension, not in agreement, but in continuous disagreements. And even though that made the journey heavier, it also made one thing clear. He was not only a good player, but a man who never chose the easy path just to be accepted. And then, as the years passed in pressure, in non-stop collisions, Gary Sheffield still continued to do what he always did best, competing at the highest level, maintaining performance in an environment that was never easy. Not with noise, not with big statements, but with the indisputable numbers. 500 home runs, a milestone that only a very small number of players in Major League Baseball history could reach. More than 2,500 hits, more than 1,600 RBIs, a career spanning many generations of pitchers, many different eras of the league, while still maintaining performance at a level that made people stop and take notice. If only looking at those numbers, the story should have been very clear. This was one of the greatest hitters of the era, This was a name worthy of being placed in the center of baseball history, but reality did not unfold in such a simple way. When Sheffield reached milestones that should have secured him a solid place in the memory of this sport, recognition still did not come in a complete way. There was no absolute consensus. There was no feeling that he had been placed where he belonged. Instead, there were debates, comparisons, questions that continued to exist. People looked at his achievements, but not everyone looked at them with the same certainty, and that made everything much more complicated than what the numbers showed. In the same era, there were players who received near immediate acclaim when they reached similar milestones. They were mentioned as symbols, as models, as names that needed no further explanation. For Sheffield, the story was different. Each time his name was brought into the discussion, it came with conditions, contexts, factors that needed to be considered. Not complete denial, but also not absolute acceptance. And when that repeated long enough, it created a feeling that was very hard to describe. The feeling that you had done everything necessary but still had not been chosen. The comparisons with players of the same time were not always fair. Not because they did not deserve it, but because the way people perceived them. And Sheffield was not the same. For some, their story was told in the direction of rising, overcoming, achieving. For Sheffield, the story often came with questions, doubts, factors outside the numbers. That did not diminish the value of what he had done, but it changed the way that value was felt. And in a sport where legacy is not only defined by achievements, but also by the way those achievements are remembered, that difference became very important. The feeling of not being chosen, even though he had met every standard, did not come in a single moment. It was not a sudden shock, but a process of accumulation. Each time a list was announced where his name was not in the position he deserved, each time a discussion took place where he was not the center, each time an opportunity for recognition passed without stopping at him, all of that added up, and over time they formed a heavy feeling, not because he did not know his own value, but because he realized that the world around him did not perceive that value in the same way. What made the disappointment deeper was that Sheffield was not someone who stood still. He did not stop after reaching 500 home runs. He did not slow down when he had enough numbers to secure a legacy. He continued to compete, continued to contribute, continued to keep a high standard that not everyone could maintain in the final stage of a career. But even when he did that, the feeling that he still had to prove himself did not disappear. It only changed form. From proving ability, it shifted to proving historical value. From proving he deserved to be on the field, it shifted to proving he deserved to be remembered. For many people, achieving what Sheffield had achieved was the end point of the journey of proving. For him, it was only part of a longer journey, a journey whose end point was not clear, because the recognition he sought was not only in the numbers, but in the way those numbers were perceived. And when that way of seeing did not change, the journey never truly ended. The disappointment was not always expressed outwardly in a clear way. Sheffield was not someone who continuously talked about not being recognized, but that did not mean he did not feel it. It was present in the way he continued to compete, in the way he reacted to questions, in the way he never allowed himself to be fully satisfied. It became part of the drive, but also part of the burden. And when a person carried both of those things for a long time, it began to shape the way they viewed the world. Perhaps from the outside, Gary Sheffield was a clear success story. A long career, impressive numbers, memorable moments. But when looking deeper, there was another layer. A layer not easy to see if stopping only at the surface. That was the story of a man who had done everything necessary, who had reached the highest standards, but still had to live with the feeling that it had never been enough to bring full recognition. And when that feeling stretched over many years, over many stages, it was not just temporary disappointment. It became part of the journey, part of the way he existed in the world he had spent his entire life conquering. Gary Sheffield continued to move forward, not because everything had become clearer, but because he did not know how to stop when the answer had not yet come. And perhaps that very thing made his story heavier than any number could describe, because when a person had done everything right and still did not receive what he deserved, the question no longer lay with him, but with the way the world chose to look at him. And then, when Gary Sheffield thought that what he had done was finally enough to shape an indisputable legacy, baseball entered one of the most complex and controversial periods in its history. It was no longer just a game of talent and effort, but an era where every achievement was placed under a thick layer of doubt. The steroid era in MLB did not arrive like a clear storm, but like a spreading fog, slowly covering everything and making the line between right and wrong become blurred. And in that fog, no one truly stood outside. Whether directly involved or not, everyone was pulled into a bigger question, whether what they achieved was truly their own or not. For Gary Sheffield, this was not a chapter he could control. It did not begin with what he did on the field, but with what happened off the field. In laboratories, in systems he did not fully understand. His name began to be mentioned alongside Balso, a name that later became a symbol for an entire controversial period. Sheffield was not the only one linked, and he was not the one with the clearest story among all those cases, but that did not prevent him from being placed in the same group, viewed through the same lens, and evaluated in the same context. His explanations did not disappear. He had spoken about what he knew, about what he believed he had used, about having no intention of cheating in the way people were describing. But in a time when public trust had been shaken, words were no longer enough to make a difference. Not everyone listened. Not everyone wanted to distinguish between different cases, and when the story had already been shaped in one direction, changing it became almost impossible. Sheffield was not only facing questions, but also facing the reality that his answers were no longer the deciding factor. The media, in its role, could not ignore such a big story, but the way the story was told was not always balanced. Headlines, quotes, and emphasized parts often leaned toward doubt rather than explanation. And in a world where information was consumed quickly, complex details were often reduced to simple conclusions. Gary Sheffield, once again, was not only facing what he had done, but also the way that was retold. And this time, the scale was larger, the impact deeper, and the consequences longer lasting than any previous period. Public opinion began to change the way it looked at him. Numbers that were once seen as proof of excellence now came with question marks. Milestones that were once considered peaks were now placed in a different context. Not everyone turned their backs, but the certainty had disappeared. And when certainty was gone, everything became more fragile. Sheffield could not go back to what he had done and redo it in a different way. He could not completely separate himself from the era in which he had competed, and so he had to live with the reality that part of his legacy was now tied to a chapter he did not fully control. What made this period heavy was not only what was said, but what was not said, the gaps in the story, the details not fully explained, the differences between cases not clarified. All of that created an incomplete picture, but one strong enough to shape perception. And in that picture, Gary Sheffield was no longer an individual with his own story, but part of a larger group, a symbol of an era that many wanted to forget but could not. Reputation, which had been built over many years, began to be affected in a way he could not stop. It was not an immediate collapse, but a slow yet clear change. The way people talked about him changed. The way he was brought into discussions changed. And, most importantly, the way he was remembered began to change. It was no longer just the swings, the numbers, the moments on the field. It was a question that always accompanied, a question mark that never completely disappeared. Gary Sheffield had gone through many difficult periods in his career, from the early days of having to prove himself to the years facing conflict and pressure. But this was a different challenge. This was not something that could be solved by playing better, by practicing more, or by changing the way he reacted. This was a bigger story than the individual, a context in which he was only a part. And when an individual is placed in such a context, keeping his own story becomes very difficult. However, even in this period, one thing did not change. Gary Sheffield did not abandon his path. He continued to compete, continued to step onto the field, continued to do what he had always done, not because everything was clear, but because he did not know how to stop when his story had not yet been fully told. But this time, each step carried a different weight. It was not only the pressure to maintain performance, but the feeling that no matter what he did, part of the world had already decided how to look at him. And perhaps that was exactly what changed everything. Not because it erased what he had done, but because it changed the way what he had done was perceived. From a story of rising and maintaining class, it became a more complex story, harder to define and heavier, a shadow not easy to name, but always present, always accompanying, and always making any question about Gary Sheffield never simply about the numbers. And when that shadow had covered long enough, it began to change not only the way the world looked at Gary Sheffield, but also the way the world decided to treat him. There was no official trial, no announced verdict, no moment that people could point to and say everything had been decided. But in some way, in the eyes of many people, the judgment already existed, not in the form of law, but in the form of perception. And that perception was strong enough to overshadow everything he had built before. Gary Sheffield was not the only one who went through that period, and he was not the clearest case to conclude. But that did not protect him from being placed in the same frame of view. When people talked about those years, his name appeared in the same sentence, in the same context, in the same line of thought. No need to prove, no need for deeper analysis. Just that connection was enough to create an impression. And once the impression had formed, changing it became extremely difficult. His numbers were still there. 500 home runs did not disappear. More than 2,500 hits still existed. The excellent seasons, the decisive moments, all remained intact. But the way people looked at those numbers had changed. Before, they were proof of excellence. Now they came with a question mark. Not everyone asked the question, but enough people did to create a difference. And in a sport where legacy is built not only by achievements, but by the way those achievements are believed, that change brought deep consequences. What made this situation more painful was the lack of clarity. There was no clear line between right and wrong in the way the story was told. There was no definitive conclusion that everyone could agree on. Instead, there was a prolonged gray area, where each person could offer their own interpretation. And in that gray area, Gary Sheffield did not have much control. He could speak, he could explain, he could offer his own perspective, but he could not force others to believe it. And when trust had been shaken, words became much lighter. The silence of the system made everything even more uncomfortable. There was no clear decision to close the story. There was no official announcement to define his position. Everything was left hanging, as if the story had never really ended. And when a story has no clear ending, it continues to exist in people's minds, continues to be repeated, continues to be interpreted in different ways. That created a feeling of unfairness not easy to name, because there was no specific action to protest against, but the result was still there. Losing the chance to be looked at fairly was not a single moment. It happened over time, through evaluations, through opportunities where he should have been placed in a different position. When discussions about legacy took place, when names were put into formal positions in history, Gary Sheffield was not always present in the way he deserved, not because he lacked achievements, but because the story around him had become more complex. And in a selection process where perception played an important role, that complexity could become a barrier. The psychology of a person in such a situation could not help but be affected. Sheffield was not someone who did not realize what was happening. He understood the way his story was being told. He saw the way his name was mentioned, and he felt the gap between what he believed was right and what the world was believing. That created a pressure unlike competition pressure. It did not come from opponents, did not come from a specific game, but from a prolonged feeling that he was being viewed through a lens that was not entirely accurate. Prejudice, once formed, does not need to be repeated every day to continue existing. It lies in the background of the way people think, in the way they react, in the way they ask questions. And for Gary Sheffield, that prejudice became part of the environment around him. Not always clear, not always direct, but always present. And when a person has to live in such an environment for a long time, it begins to affect the way they perceive themselves. What is worth noting is that even when facing all of that, Sheffield did not give up defending his perspective. He did not stay completely silent. He continued to speak, continued to explain, continued to hold firm to his own view of what had happened. But holding firm did not mean he did not feel the burden. It was like standing firm in a strong current. You may not be swept away, but you still have to use a lot of strength to keep your position. There is a big difference between being defeated by an opponent on the field and being defined by a story off the field. On the field, everything can be resolved by skill, by effort, by strategy. Off the field, everything is much more complex. There is no clear way to change the way others think. There is no game you can win to end the debate. And when that debate stretches over many years, it becomes part of the legacy, whether you want it or not. Gary Sheffield had spent his entire career building an image based on what he could do, but in this period, he had to face the reality that that image was not completely in his hands. It was influenced by bigger factors, by wider stories, by perceptions he could not control. And when that happened, the feeling of unfairness was not only about what had been lost, but also about there being no clear way to get it back. And so one of the most difficult periods in Gary Sheffield's story was not when he played poorly, not when he suffered injuries, but when he had to face a verdict that was not announced but was still felt everywhere. A verdict with no document, no date, but with long-lasting influence. And in the eyes of many people, even without an official conclusion, the story had been decided in a way he could not easily change. And when the controversies off the field had still not settled, Gary Sheffield's body began to send signals he could not ignore. It was not a single injury with a clear beginning and end, but a series of problems that accumulated over the years. Shoulder, wrist, knee, the areas that bore the greatest pressure from thousands of swings and continuous movements, began to react in ways that were no longer easy to control. The pains no longer appeared and disappeared quickly as before, but lasted longer, deeper, and directly affected the way he played. But in an environment where performance was everything, admitting the decline was not an easy choice. Gary Sheffield was not someone who waited for his body to fully recover before returning. He had become accustomed to stepping forward even when not ready, and that did not change when injuries appeared. Practice sessions became heavier. Movements that had once been very natural now required more effort, and each time on the field carried a consideration he had not needed to think about before. But even though he clearly felt the difference, he still continued to compete. Not because he did not realize the limits, but because he did not accept letting those limits define him. In the eyes of the team, a player's position was not based only on the past, but on the ability to contribute in the present. And when the body began to decline, the pressure to maintain the position became clearer than ever. Sheffield was no longer a name that could be kept just because of what he had done before. He had to continue proving that he could still contribute, could still make a difference, could still stand alongside younger, faster, stronger players. That was not only a physical challenge, but also a psychological challenge. Because each time he stepped onto the field, he was not only competing against opponents, but also competing against his own body. The days of competing were no longer like before. There were moments when he knew that his swing was no longer as quick as it used to be, that his reflexes were no longer as sharp as before, that what had once come naturally now required more effort to achieve. But instead of stepping back, he moved forward. Not because he did not feel the change, but because he did not allow that change to become a reason to stop. In his thinking, stopping was not a simple decision. It was like admitting that the journey had ended, that what he had fought to build could no longer continue. The fatigue began to accumulate in a way that was not always clearly visible from the outside. On the field, he was still Gary Sheffield, still had hits that made people pay attention, still had moments when he proved he had not disappeared. But behind those moments were longer recovery hours, longer-lasting pains, nights when the body did not fully rest. And when physical fatigue lasted, it began to affect the spirit, not in a way that made him give up, but in a way that made each step heavier. There is a big difference between competing when still in prime condition and competing while carrying limits. Sheffield understood that difference clearly, but he did not allow it to change the way he approached the game. He still prepared, still focused, still set high standards for himself. But inside, he knew that everything was no longer the same as before, and that created its own pressure, a pressure that did not come from others, but from his own desire to maintain the image he had built. Not accepting an early stop was not an impulsive decision. It was the result of an entire process of the way he viewed his career. Gary Sheffield did not see baseball only as a job. It was the path that had taken him out of where he started. It was the way he defined himself. It was something that had been tied to him throughout his life. Therefore, leaving it was not only ending a career, but letting go of a part of himself. And that was something he did not easily do. But no matter how strong the will, the body still had its own limits. There were days when stepping onto the field was already a challenge. There were games where he had to adjust the way he played to fit his condition. That did not make him weak in the usual sense, but it changed the way he experienced the game. It was no longer absolute freedom, but a balance between desire and ability. And in that balance, each decision carried greater weight. The fatigue came not only from injuries, but also from the years of having to continuously prove himself, having to continuously face pressure from many sides. When the body began to decline, all that pressure did not disappear. It was still there, but now placed on a foundation that was no longer as solid as before. That made everything harder, not because he lacked ability, but because he had to do more to achieve the same result. And in all of that, Gary Sheffield still continued. Not because everything was easy, but because he did not know how to stop when the journey had not truly closed. He carried the pains, carried the fatigue, carried the limits, but still stepped onto the field, still swung the bat, still found ways to contribute. And perhaps it was precisely in this period that one thing became clearer than ever. Talent can take a person to the peak, but will is what keeps them there for so long, even when everything around begins to fall apart. And then, when his body no longer allowed Gary Sheffield to continue prolonging the fight, his career closed, not with a brilliant moment watched by the whole world, but with a silence almost opposite to everything he had given. There was no symbolic farewell, no pre-written ending like the perfect stories usually told about legends. He left the field while the numbers were still there, the proofs of greatness still intact. But the feeling of completion was not, because what he had sought throughout the journey, full recognition, seemed to still be somewhere, never truly arriving. When the career ended, the story should have moved to another stage, where what he had done was looked back on with clarity and respect. But for Gary Sheffield, everything was not that simple. Instead of consensus, instead of a solid position in history, he stepped into a period where everything continued to be questioned. The Hall of Fame debate was not a short-term discussion. It stretched through each year, through each ballot, through each time his name was brought up and then postponed. It was not a definitive rejection, but also not acceptance. and that very suspended state made everything heavier. The Hall of Fame for many players is a clear ending point for a career. It is where numbers are transformed into legacy, where controversies are set aside to make room for recognition. But for Sheffield, it became a symbol of what was unfinished. Each year that passed without his name being called was not only a delay, but a reminder that his story had not yet been resolved. And when the waiting stretched long, it was no longer only about the result, but about the feeling of being left outside a system he had spent his entire life contributing to. Meanwhile, the baseball world did not stop. New generations appeared, bringing new stories, new names, new moments. Young players stepped up, were honored, were praised, were placed in positions that Sheffield had once had to fight to reach. That was not unusual. That was how every sport operated. But for a person who had not yet been placed in the right position in history, that movement carried a different feeling. It was not jealousy, but a feeling of being left behind when his own story had not yet been fully told. The honoring stories continued to be written, but Gary Sheffield's name was not always in them in the way he deserved. He could be mentioned, but not as the center. He could be recognized, but not with the certainty that his numbers should have brought. And when that repeated over time, it created a void. Not because he had no legacy, but because that legacy had not been placed in the right spot. The feeling of being left behind did not come from a specific event. It came from seeing what was happening around, from realizing that the world had moved to a new chapter while his own chapter was still unfinished. Sheffield no longer stepped onto the field every day, no longer had the chance to change the way people looked at him through new performances. What he had was only what he had done, and the way that was interpreted now lay outside his control. The questions were still there, not because there were no answers, but because there was no consensus. Was he one of the greatest hitters? The numbers said yes. Did he deserve to be honored at the highest level? Many believed yes, but not all. And that very lack of unity made the story unable to close. It continued to exist in discussions, in rankings, in the way people remembered him. What made this period difficult was that there was no clear way to change it. On the field, Sheffield could respond with performance. Off the field, he could only wait, and that waiting had no specific deadline, no guarantee, no clear ending point. It was like standing in front of a door you knew you deserved to walk through but did not know when it would open, or whether it would open at all. Gary Sheffield did not completely disappear from baseball. He still appeared, still spoke about his perspective, still participated in discussions when necessary. But his role had changed. From a person who created the story, he became part of a story being retold by others. And in that process, he did not always have control over the way the story was shaped. Perhaps what made all of this heavy was its prolongation. It was not a clear failure that could be accepted and moved past, but a prolonged, unfinished state that stretched over many years. And when such a long journey has no clear ending point, it leaves a feeling that is hard to describe. Not complete loss, but also not completeness. Gary Sheffield had done everything a player could do to build a legacy. He had overcome the past, had competed at the highest level, had reached milestones that very few could touch. But when he stepped off the field, he carried a story that had not been fully resolved. And perhaps that very thing made his story not only about what had happened, but also about what was still waiting for an answer that, to this day, has not come. And when the questions still lingered through the years, Gary Sheffield's legacy began to be looked back on, not with a clear conclusion, but with overlapping layers of evaluation. If only looking at the numbers, the story was almost beyond dispute. More than 500 home runs, more than 2,500 hits, a batting average near .300, along with the ability to maintain performance across different eras of the league. Those were signs of one of the most complete and durable hitters baseball had ever had. Those statistics were not only enough to put him in the top group, but also placed him alongside names that had been solidly framed in history. But what made Sheffield's story different was that those numbers did not automatically transform into consensus. In many historical rankings, his name appeared but not always in the position that what he had achieved should have brought. There were lists where he was placed at the center, viewed as one of the most dangerous hitters of the era. But there were also lists where he was pushed lower, placed after names with similar or even lower numbers. That inconsistency was not random. It reflected the reality that Gary Sheffield's legacy was not only evaluated by achievements, but also influenced by the way people felt about his entire story. The public did not look at him in a single way. There were people who looked at him and saw a player who had overcome every limit, who had maintained class in a harsh environment, who had reached milestones that not everyone could touch. For them, Sheffield was an underrated symbol, a name deserving of a higher place in history. But there were also people who looked at the same man and saw question marks, saw factors that made them not completely certain. And between those two ways of seeing, there was no clear unity. That made his legacy unable to be framed in the way many others had been. There was no simple story to tell. There was no conclusion that everyone agreed on. Instead, there was a complex picture where the pieces did not always fit together completely. And when a legacy cannot be framed, it continues to exist in an open state, where each generation can look at it and offer their own understanding. Gary Sheffield could no longer change what he had done. The numbers had been recorded, the games had been played, the moments had passed, but the way those things were perceived was still continuing to change. Over time, as the distance from the controversial events grew, as new generations looked at history with a different perspective, it was possible that his story would be re-evaluated, not to erase what had happened, but to place it in a broader context where achievements and circumstances were considered together. The real value of a career is not always recognized immediately. There are stories that need time to be understood, need distance to be seen more clearly. And perhaps Gary Sheffield was one of those cases. What he had done on the field did not change with time, but the way the world looked at it could change. And in that change, there was the possibility that his position would gradually become clearer. What made this period special was not what was missing, but what was still waiting to be completed. An unfinished legacy does not mean an insufficient legacy. It only means the story is still being written, not by the person involved, but by the way history is retold. And, in the case of Gary Sheffield, that story had not yet reached the point where all the elements were placed in the right spot. There is a special silence that accompanies unfinished stories. It is not the silence of being forgotten, but the silence of not yet having a final answer. Sheffield did not disappear from baseball's memory. He was still there, in the numbers, in the videos, in the discussions. But he was not there in the way that a fully defined legacy is. He existed in the space between recognition and doubt, between what had been achieved and the way that was perceived. And perhaps that very thing made his story carry a different weight, not because it lacked success, but because it lacked conclusion. A great, long career full of achievements but still not closed with a period that everyone accepts. And while many others had their stories clearly shaped, Gary Sheffield remained in a state where everything could change, but it was not known when. His legacy was not erased. It was only not yet placed in its final position. And in that period of time, it continued to exist as a reminder that not every great story has a clear ending. Some stories, like Gary Sheffield's, need more time, more distance, and perhaps more willingness from the world to look back, to understand, and to place correctly what had always been there. And when looking back at that entire journey, from a child growing up in a world with no room for safety to a man standing in the biggest stadiums, Gary Sheffield had never really had a smooth path. His life was not built from easy moments, but from times when he had to stand up by himself, when no one was there to support him. From Tampa, where childhood was covered in instability and vigilance, to Major League Baseball, where every day was a test, He had gone through it all not with protection, but with the ability to keep himself from collapsing. There was no system that truly sheltered him, no safe corridor for him to walk through, and no silences long enough for him to rest without worrying about the next step. Throughout that journey, there were times when he had to start over without any guarantee. The early days, stepping into MLB with doubtful eyes from all sides. The periods of being labeled, being misunderstood, being placed in stories he did not fully control. The injuries that made his body no longer respond as before, forcing him to compete in pain, and the controversies off the field. The shadows not easy to erase, that made everything he had done placed in a more complex context. But in all of that, there was one common point that did not change. He did not stop, not because everything became easier, but because he did not know how to give up when the path was still ahead. Gary Sheffield was not someone who was given immediate recognition. He did not step into history with absolute consensus, but that did not change the way he approached the game. He still competed, still prepared, still set high standards for himself, even when the world around him did not always respond in the way he expected. There were times when he had to fight alone against the way others perceived him. There were times when he had to continue moving forward without clear support. And there were times when he had to hold firm to his belief in his own value while everything around became uncertain. His persistence was not an abstract concept. It was present in every stage of his career, in every decision not to step back, in every time he stepped onto the field, even knowing he would have to prove himself once again. It was not loud, did not need to be recognized to exist. It was simply part of who he was, formed from a very early age and never disappeared. And that very persistence kept him there longer, allowed him to reach milestones that many could not touch, even when the path to them was not easy at all. The image of Gary Sheffield, when looked at from the outside, might not always be clear. He was not the perfect symbol that everyone could easily agree on, but when looking deeper, one thing could not be denied. He was a man who never stopped striving, never stopped moving forward, no matter the circumstances, whether in the early years of life, in the peak periods, or in the most difficult moments. He always kept a consistent direction, not because he did not encounter obstacles, but because he did not let those obstacles decide his stopping point. Gary Sheffield's legacy might not be framed in the traditional way. It does not only lie in the numbers, even though those numbers are very impressive. It also does not only lie in the titles, even though he achieved many things that any player would desire. His legacy lies in the endurance, in the ability to withstand, in the act of continuing to move forward even when there was no certainty that the reward would come. It lies in the fact that he did not wait for recognition to continue, but continued even when recognition had not arrived. It may take more time for the world to place Gary Sheffield in the position he deserves. The debates may still continue, but no matter what the final result is, one thing has been clear for a long time: he fought. Not only in the games watched by millions, but also in the moments no one saw, the practices that were not recorded, the pains that were not spoken, the thoughts he had to overcome by himself. Those were battles with no audience, no scoreboard, but they shaped the man he became more than anything else. And perhaps it was precisely in those moments no one observed that Gary Sheffield's story became clearest, not the story of a man who was always honored, but the story of a man who continued to move forward even when he was not sure he would be honored. Not the story of a perfect journey, but the story of a journey full of collisions, but never stopping. A man who had gone through all of that, not to become perfect, but to exist, to stand firm, and to prove that even when there was no light shining on it, there were still battles worth telling. Gary Sheffield did not need to be perfect to be memorable. He only needed to continue, as he had always done. And in that continuation there was a value that was not always measured by titles or position in history, but still had its own weight. A value built over time, through challenges, through the times of standing up when no one was there to witness. And perhaps that is the deepest part of the legacy he left. not only what he achieved, but the way he overcame everything to achieve it. The story of Gary Sheffield is not only a sports journey, but a haunting record of injustice and human endurance. When looking back, what makes people feel poignant is not that he did not succeed, because more than 500 home runs, thousands of hits, and a career spanning many decades have proven the opposite, but that a man who had done almost everything right still did not receive full recognition. From a childhood full of instability in Tampa, where he had to protect himself too early, to the years in MLB where he was continuously doubted even though he had proven his ability, Sheffield seemed never allowed to live in a state of enough. Even when reaching the peak with All-Star and World Series, he still carried an empty feeling because of the lack of recognition. Then came the Belko period, when there was no clear verdict but his reputation was still overshadowed by doubt, showing a system that could condemn by perception more than by truth. And when his body gradually weakened, having to compete in pain but still not stopping, that was no longer sports, that was a battle for survival. For the American people, the lesson here is not only about individual effort, but also about the way society evaluates people. Success does not always come with fairness, and sometimes the true value of a person is only recognized after many years. Sheffield reminds us that, be careful when judging, look deeper into the circumstances, and most importantly, keep moving forward, even when the world is not yet ready to recognize you. If the story of Gary Sheffield makes you think, please hit subscribe and leave a like as an acknowledgement for a man who fought his entire life in silence. Thank you for accompanying, and see you in the next video where we continue to explore great destinies that have never been fully recognized.